This program is rated PG. It contains themes and scenes which may not be suitable for very young audiences. Parental guidance is advised.
Be advised that the views and opinions of the hosts and guests do not reflect those of the station.
What would happen if you built a refuge for a persecuted people in a place where another people already lived? In the next few minutes, you'll learn why this moral quandary is at the root of the struggle between Israelis and Palestinians, and what you can do to help achieve a just peace for everyone in the region. First, there are a couple of things it's helpful to understand. One, many Jews fled harsh persecution in anti-Semitic Europe, especially the Nazi Holocaust. Zionists encouraged massive immigration to historic Palestine, at that time a British colony, where Jews had an age-old connection and where small Jewish communities had long existed among larger groups of indigenous peoples. But when the UN offered the Jewish immigrants the majority of the land for a new state called Israel, for the indigenous Palestinians who lived there, it was a massive destruction of life. They rejected the UN's partition plan, and several Arab states invaded the new state of Israel. Israeli forces essentially erased over 400 Palestinian villages and towns. By the end of the fighting, Israel controlled 78% of historic Palestine. And when 750,000 Palestinians who fled or were expelled during fighting tried to return to their homes where the new state now stood, they were permanently barred by the Israeli government. While over 100,000 of their relatives and neighbors who hadn't left became second-class citizens of the new state, along with the new Jewish majority. Today, Palestinian refugees and their descendants number in the millions. Most are in the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, and Jordan. Many are spread throughout the world, with millions still living in refugee camps, seeking to return to their homeland. To sum up, one group of refugees found a much-needed home, but in the process, a new group of refugees was created. Here's the second.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Philippines Uncut. I'm your host, Buddy Cunanan. Now, on this show, we talk about everything under the sun, and tonight's topic is one that is quite controversial, and it is one that many people have many strong feelings and sentiments and views about. I'm talking about none other than the Israeli-Palestine conflict. Now, for the past several weeks, we've seen through the media the carnage and chaos that is happening in Gaza, carried out by the Israeli military, ostensibly pursuing the Hamas terrorist group. Now, amidst so much misinformation and disinformation, a lot of people have been confused about this issue. So tonight, we're going to try to clear this issue with some very esteemed guests. And joining me for the first segment is, Jamal Ashley Abbas, and he is a professional lecturer of FEU and FIATI. Good evening, Jamal, and welcome to Philippines Uncut.
Good evening.
Yes. It's a pleasure to have you here, and let's begin this discussion by talking about your background. Tell us a bit about yourself.
Well, I'm very interested in this thing in the first place because I studied there in the Middle East. I studied in Saudi Arabia, and during that time in the 70s, there was also a lot of, Israel invaded Lebanon at that time, and there was a big hullabaloo. And before, media was not as accessible as now. There's a huge difference now and then, because before, if Israel invades Gaza or any country, they can actually put out a news blackout.
Yes.
And very few people can. But here, right now, because of the social media, because of the satellite, everything, we can really go down and know what's going on.
Yes. And yet, despite all this access to media, as you mentioned, social media, and of course, you've got all the cable international cable news networks. As I mentioned in my opening spiel, there's so much information, misinformation and disinformation being spread, so much so that a lot of viewers, a lot of Filipinos are actually misinformed about this topic. But before we go into that, let's talk about, Jamal, let's talk about your background. You are a professorial lecturer of FEU and FIATI. What is exactly your job?
I teach mostly media studies, mass communication, visual communication, TV,
yes,
and film also.
Oh,
My
okay.
specialization is film.
Yes, and it says here that you have a degree in petroleum engineering. So you have an MA in media studies, film, and petroleum engineering. Very interesting combination.
Right. Actually, I'm the first Filipino petroleum engineer.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow, that's quite a distinction, huh?
And I'm also the first Filipino graduate of MA Media Studies at UP.
Oh, bravo. And you mentioned earlier that you studied in Saudi Arabia. What did you study there?
Petroleum engineering.
And this is where you got your degree.
Yeah.
Okay, how did you get involved in this whole issue? What is your involvement in this, the issue of this conflict?
Well, professionally, I'm a writer. Foremost, I'm a writer.
Yeah.
I write for different publications. I used to be an editor also, and I blog. I'm a blogger, so I try to keep up, abreast with all the news going on.
Yes.
Especially with, as I said, mainstream media is controlled by the dominant elites. So not a lot of news can come out to the people.
Yes, and hopefully through programs like this, we are an independent cable news channel, people can get enlightened and do their own research. Don't take at face value what you're being fed to by the big networks, mainstream media. Okay, let's talk about this conflict. What is the root cause of what we're seeing now, which has caused so much grief, not just for that region, but for, it's divided the world, okay? And, as we saw, I uploaded this teaser, which we're going to have more of those teasers going through this show in the form of an animation that explains the conflict. But let's hear from you. What is the main issue?
Yeah, it all started after actually it started before World War II, before World War I. It started in 1896 when they formed the Zionist movement. And Lord Balfour, I think it was a British minister, made a declaration or a statement, letter actually, to the second Baron Rothschild, who's head of the Zionist movement, that the British government, the British Empire, was going to support the aim of these Jews who wants to create a state of their own.
And at that time, the British had mandate over Palestine.
They had Palestine. They
Yes.
had lots of places in,
Middle
actually
East.
not much, but they improved later after World War I.
Okay, interesting. You should mention the Zionist movement. What is this? What was the Zionist movement?
These are
How is this different from Judaism or from
Judaism is a religion,
Okay.
while Zionism is a political movement.
Okay.
Where European Jews wants to have their own state, a Jewish state, and they wanted to be Palestine.
Now, why didn't the Jews have their own home? I mean, how come they were, until the state of Israel was formed, why were this wandering group of people? So it seems to be, they were in Europe, they were in the Middle East, they were all over the place in America. How come?
During it's the course of historical evolution. Remember, they were in the Middle East before,
Yes.
but then when the Arabs came, Islam came, not the Arabs, the Islam came, and through the Arabs, many of the people in the Middle East became Muslims. A lot of the Jews became Muslims themselves, just as some of the Jews became Christians when Christianity flourished. Very few went out to Europe.
Yes.
And through the years, through the centuries, the number of the Jews spread out, and they intermarried with other nationalities.
Yeah.
So the thing is, the Jews, the Zionists, always claim this principle of the right of return.
Explain, what is the right of return?
They claim that it is their right to return to Palestine, their home.
Okay.
during the time of King David and all.
How long ago are we talking about? When you say the right of return is their claim to being to return to their ancestral homeland, how long are we talking about here? We're talking about King David. I mean, obviously this is before Christ, so at least we're talking about over 2,000 years, obviously.
Yeah.
No?
But at least in the Middle Ages, at least at 500, 600 years. But you know, it's the Jews at that time. The Jews in Europe really had nothing anymore to do with the Jews in Israel, in
Yes.
Palestine.
Who were the ones who did not leave
Yeah.
Palestine? Okay, these are the Jews you said who actually the diaspora, the
Yeah.
Jewish diaspora that actually spread all over the world, spread to Europe as mentioned. No?
Just like the Christians.
Yes.
They went all over the
Of
world.
course. Who were also actually Jews. Originally,
Yeah,
they were
originally.
Jews, right? I mean, Jesus Christ and his apostles were Jews.
Yeah.
They-
He was a Jew. So
Yes. Part of this whole diaspora that spread.
in fact, when the Crusades, when the Christians wanted that right of return, they wanted to get back Jerusalem. The Christians in Jerusalem, in Palestine, fought with the Muslims against the European invaders.
Yes. Okay, let's talk about now. Let's talk about what's happening. I mean, okay, so you mentioned the Balfour Declaration and the intent of the European Jews to create a homeland in Palestine.
Yeah.
So what happened? Okay, so we know. Fast forward to the World War II.
World War II.
We know that the Jewish people, and we have many Jewish friends. They suffered greatly. You know, I mean, there were millions killed by the Nazi regime.
Yeah,
Okay,
and because of that, somehow the Allies felt guilty. And
why was there guilt?
Well, in the first place, you know, in Europe, if remember Shakespeare's Shylock. Shylock is saying...
It's someone who lends money.
Yeah, and
Shylock.
people hated the Jews. The Europeans hated the Jews. There were many times in the history of Europe where the Jews were expelled because...
From one country or another?
Yeah, right.
Okay.
And because they have their own culture and somehow they don't integrate with the host countries.
Okay.
So they want to make their own. In fact, you know, Mindanao was one of the finalists. America was proposing Mindanao to be the Jewish home.
Wow, that would have been a whole new
instead-
problem altogether for
Yeah,
us here in the Philippines.
Instead of
Yeah.
Palestine,
Yeah.
because remember they owned Mindanao.
We were an
Philippines.
American colony,
Yeah, the
for sure.
American.
Yeah.
And they tried. I read this once when Roosevelt went to King Abdulaziz of Saudi Arabia, and he told him, you know, the Germans, Hitler killed 6 million Jews, and now we have to give them a very nice place, their own state, and we want to give them Palestine. And the old king said, oh, why don't you give them the best place in Germany? Since it's the Germans who kicked them out,
Yes,
why don't you
yes,
give them
yes.
the best, the most beautiful place in Germany and make it an Israelite state? Why Palestine?
Yes. No. Okay. So there was a problem, no? After World War II, what to do with these people they suffered greatly. They were displaced from many, because many of them were actually citizens of Germany or France, or they were citizens, no?
Yeah.
And they were displaced as well. So what to do with these people now? And the solution of the West was to create the state of Israel in Palestine. Now,
According to the Zionist.
to the plan, the Zionist plan, yeah. Now, what was the problem there? What was the problem with creating a Jewish state in Palestine?
There are Palestinians in Palestine.
So yeah,
Palestinians, both Jews, Christians, and Muslims.
there were already people living in
In
Palestine
Palestine,
at the
yeah,
time
at the time.
that the state of Israel was being
Yeah,
created.
more than 1 million of them.
Okay, okay.
And so they had to kick them out practically. And so all the Arabs, they had a war, and the Palestinians, as your teaser
Yeah.
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 showed, all the Palestinians had to leave.
Yeah. Now, we're seeing now some images of the current problem in Palestine now, and this is the incessant attack, the non-stop attack of the Israeli military on the Palestinians in Gaza. And as you saw from the video earlier, Gaza is actually a very small place now, no? Originally it was huge, but then it's been shrunk by settlements and all that. And now these are some images of what's going on now in Gaza, the destruction and death. Now, what are your comments about this latest conflagration?
In the first place, Gaza is, I think, the biggest prison in the world.
Okay.
They are practically a prison.
Mm.
You know, they can't get anything. Nothing can get out or in without the Israeli gods, knowing it.
Yeah. Yeah.
They can't have oil. They can't have water. They can't have anything without the approval of Israel.
It's interesting because some people have called it apartheid.
Apartheid, yeah.
In a way, I mean, it's like two people living in one space and yet not sharing the same rights and privileges.
Because technically, Gaza is part of the state of Israel.
Yes.
But in the state of Israel, the non-Jews are not really considered citizens. They do not have the same rights.
Yes, yes.
And especially those in Gaza, because Gaza does now a special political status.
Yes, and what's happened, it's very shocking, Jamal, because this whole thing started when three Israeli youths, teenagers were abducted and later on killed. They're not sure yet who did it. Okay, they're not sure if Hamas did it. They're not sure which faction did it. They're not even sure if Hamas itself did it. But okay, that's seems to be what triggered this whole conflict now. This newest conflict, and it's very disturbing because. According to news reports today, there have been almost 1,200 dead, civilian dead. We're talking about men, women, and children, civilians who've been killed because of the Israeli military attacks on Gaza. Now, people are calling this a war of Israel against Hamas. Is that can one characterize it as a war against Hamas? And what are your feelings about Hamas?
That's what's called in journalism contextualizing. They're giving the false context. Most of the media are always trying to give the false context. Israel is good at that. Like in the 2006, when similar incidents when two soldiers were
in Lebanon. We're talking about the Israel-Lebanon conflict.
Before the Lebanon, it was still Gaza because it's the Palestinians who abducted those two soldiers and they attacked Gaza.
Yeah.
And it's the same thing. It's so funny when you listen to the Israelites, they always talk about as if the war just started, 2 days before. The war of the conflict did not start with the killing of the teens, or with the two soldiers. This started in 1946.
With the so it all, according to you, it goes back to what happened was the displacement of people already living on the land by another people.
Right.
And that is the root cause. It's about land.
Exactly. And the funny thing is when these Palestinians who fled in 1948 because of the war and they went back, as your video showed, they were not allowed to enter so where was the right to return, the right of return?
Yeah. Actually, it's interesting you mentioned that everything you mentioned. We actually have a short teaser in the second segment, which really illuminates, really explains all of these things in a very simplistic way for everyone to understand. Jamal, I like to tell some people who I've talked about this. It's like it's a matter of land. Let's say if there's already people living on a piece of land, you're going to put another people there by force. There's going to be problems, right?
Right.
So what you're saying is,
actually, there's a really even bigger problem, because the Gaza problem is very similar to the Moro problem in the south. But at least in the Moro problem, if we go out of Mindanao, at least we are not, we are not refugees. We're still, however we are discriminated upon or not, but we're still quote-unquote citizens. But these Palestinians, they stay in other countries, in Lebanon, in Syria, but they're not considered citizens. Although they are Arabs, and before these nation states, came up only after World War II.
Yeah.
But when they went to Syria, to Jordan,
to Lebanon,
they're all considered refugees.
Okay, we'll touch on that later when we come back for a second segment. Guys, more of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict when Philippines and God returns.
for everyone in the region. First, there are a couple of things it's helpful to understand. One, many Jews fled harsh persecution in anti-Semitic Europe, especially the Nazi Holocaust. Zionists encouraged massive immigration to historic Palestine, at that time a British colony, where Jews had an age-old connection and where small Jewish communities had long existed among larger groups of indigenous peoples. But when the UN offered the Jewish immigrants the majority of the land for a new state called Israel, for the indigenous Palestinians who lived there, what would happen if you built a refuge for a persecuted people in a place where another people already lived? In the next few minutes, you'll learn why this moral quandary is at the root of the struggle between Israelis and Palestinians, and what you can do to help achieve a just peace along with the new Jewish majority. Today, Palestinian refugees and their descendants number in the millions. Most are in the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, and Jordan. Many are spread throughout the world, with millions still living in refugee camps, seeking to return to their homeland. To sum up, one group of refugees found a much-needed home, but in the process, a new group of refugees was created. Here's the second.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Philippines Uncut. I'm your host, Buddy Kunanan. Now, on this show, we talk about everything under the sun, and tonight's topic is one that is...
It was a massive destruction of life. They rejected the UN's partition plan, and several Arab states invaded the new state of Israel. Israeli forces essentially erased over 400 Palestinian villages and towns. By the end of the fighting, Israel controlled 78% of historic Palestine. And when 750,000 Palestinians who fled or were expelled during fighting tried to return to their homes where the new state now stood, they were permanently barred by the Israeli government. While over 100,000 of their relatives and neighbors who hadn't left became second-class citizens of the new state, along
This program is rated PG. It contains themes and scenes which may not be suitable for very young audiences. Parental guidance is advised.
Be advised that the views and opinions of the hosts and guests do not reflect those of the station.